everybody. All right, so we're going to keep going. Again, I know this history section is incredibly long. And while we will have some other sections that will feel incredibly long, this one just has so much information jam-packed into it that I want to make sure we're giving it enough time. So we're going to talk about immigration law for a second. We're going to backtrack essentially to 1790 through 1924 and just kind of talk about immigration. So in 1790, we did the naturalization law, which essentially stated that white people born in America are granted citizenship. Now, the idea of who was white and not changes, and we'll get into that soon. In 1857, Dred Scott versus Stanford, it acknowledged that Black people were not citizens legally. In 1866, said that birthright citizenship for Black persons in the established birthright citizenship for Black persons in the U.S. In 1868, the 14th Amendment constitutionalized Black people as citizens. In 1882, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, which essentially was limiting or downright excluding all immigration coming in from China or of anyone of Chinese descent. And that was due to the fact that, it was due to a lot of geopolitical situations, but mostly it was due to the fact that in California, Chinese agricultural farmers were doing rather well for themselves and growing into a population that was actually challenging the power that the white agricultural individuals had in the California area, which forced kind of this political hand. In 1887, you have the Dawes Act forcing Indigenous people to give up communal ownership of lands. So essentially, the U.S. government owns all land that they're on, even though they are their own entity, which gets into some murky things too. We'll talk about that more later in the semester. In 1989, citizenships to Asian-born granted citizenship to any Asian-born in any person from the Asian countries born in the U.S., but not to those who immigrated. 1917 Immigration Act barring Asiatic barred zone, which essentially was in reference to this granting of citizenship. We want there was pushback, and in every political entity, you're going to see waves of pushback and then more rights given. So it's kind of like push and pull, which I'm doing waves for push and pull. I don't know. It's late, friends. In 1922, Ozawa versus the United States, whiteness was defined by Caucasian ancestry, which is interesting because the Caucasian mountains and what is considered Caucasian comes from this people that were indigenous to the Caucasus Mountains, which is not anywhere near Europe. It's actually to the west. Nope, that's east. To the east, if you're looking at a map, to the west. How does that work? It doesn't matter. It's in between essentially where Russia and China butt up against all of the other states. It would be probably, I'm trying to think of which countries it would fall into now, but there's a mountain range in there, and the people in which immigrated from that area did end up in Europe in some capacities, but also migrated to several other areas, and it's a fairly small population. And so not all Europeans are descendants of that particular ancestry, and so it got a little wonky. And so essentially what happened was Singh from India came in and challenged this ruling that whiteness was defined by Caucasian ancestry because he had Caucasian ancestry, even though he also had Indian ancestry. And essentially that it contradicted the previous ruling and said, well, fine, well, then whiteness is not defined by Caucasian ancestry because we can't have you in the bunch, essentially. And so they were trying to figure out as exclusionary as they could possibly be, while also a bunch of really smart people of color essentially challenged every ounce of those things legally to essentially make a definition of whiteness that allowed for more people to be part of it. And I have Osawa down here, and I have Singh down here as well. And essentially, these two individuals, were brilliant, and the way they worked through the court system was really, really well done. However, neither one of them ended up being as part of this, and part of that came down to this gatekeeping process that was happening, where white people from European countries specifically, and certain European countries specifically, were doing a lot of gatekeeping and figuring out who they would consider white and who they wouldn't, based on the amount of power and connection that any specific group had. And then in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act added quotas to essentially any given demographic, and how many of those individuals of that demographic could come into the country. All right, so we're going to go down here. We're going to talk about some of those key legal cases just a little bit more. The Johnson-Reed Act, or the Immigration Act of 1924. How many immigrants by geographic region in Europe? And there was floor exclusions. Essentially, anyone from the Western Hemisphere could not immigrate. Asian persons could not. Descendants of slaves could not. And indigenous persons could not be considered immigrants or considered citizens. There were no restrictions from anyone from Mexico, and only 100 people were allowed from China, Japan, India, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South America combined. So that's a very low number of people considering how many were immigrating at this period in time. All right. Why? No. All right. And then we're going to go to some of the core groups that really challenged this idea of whiteness and had a long history of kind of bouncing in between what was considered white and what was not, are the Irish, Jewish individuals, and Italians. And we're going to talk a little bit about them. For Irish, they faced a long history of oppression in this country, and due to religious wars, both in Europe and when they came here, a lot of the very beginning of Irish immigration into the US was under indentured servitude. And so there was this level of discrimination already built in for Irish Americans. They faced a lot of hardships and worked in manual labor jobs, low income generating jobs. And they slowly used their newly legalized whiteness as means to ensure economic security and established whiteness based on the proxy to Black Americans. So essentially, when we talked about earlier how we were making those distinct groups and those and allowing this space where those Irish immigrants who had been treated as indentured servants and were starting to rally with slaves, essentially, those two groups, when they made the distinction, and essentially white persons of power essentially giving Irish enough of a push up socially in order to allow them to garner their whiteness by being able to create those distinct categories away from Black Americans. And that's essentially how Irish people in America started to be considered part of that demographic of white, if that makes sense. Jewish individuals, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, which is considered discrimination, hostility, or prejudice against Jewish people. There was a lot of that. There was a lot of exclusion from labor unions. There was a lot of forced craftsmen to take over lower skilled jobs instead of the things that they had been trained in, say maybe like taking manufacturer work or taking work that was key to agriculture or things of that nature, as opposed to taking jobs in the actual trades that they were trained in. They were barred from universities, and that didn't really change until after World War II. And it included this social idea of whiteness by the 1950s. But if you look at that, that's not that long ago. And there's still quite a bit of an anti-Semitic movement in the US, especially in the Southeast in particular. And while and just as a reminder, when something as recently as 1950s has occurred in this country, that does not mean economically this particular group has had the same level of um, generational wealth or the ability to acquire generational wealth or the ability to acquire that American dream as some of the other groups that have come into and immigrated into the United States. Italians are stereotyped when they first started immigrating into the US as criminals and discriminated against for being Catholic, which is interesting given how much the Catholic Church has had influence on the United States and its policies for so long. And this really put this difference between someone as in the Nordic countries as white versus white people. And so while they were saying, like, yes, we understand that you have pale skin and have this whiteness, but you're not from that same part or region in Europe, or you're not from this particular area of Europe that we want to consider white. And so you're going to be like less white. We'll call you white adjacent for a while. But legally, they were white. They just necessarily weren't socially or economically. And by that, I mean they weren't getting the same jobs. They weren't allowed the same particular like educational opportunities, things of that nature. Now, again, that balanced out by about the 1950s as well. Assimilation, and we talk about this a little bit when we talk about these three groups especially, but assimilation is when people lose their ethnic distinctiveness and become part of the mainstream. And in a lot of ways, these groups were mandated to do this in order to fit into a more centralized European feel of what America was trying to become at that point. And in doing that, they were encouraged, if not downright forced to take away some of that uniqueness from their culture to fit in more. And that came in terms of terminology, in terms of language altogether, in terms of religious ideology, et cetera, et cetera. And there's racialization when people came to be recognized as part of the racial group. And all of these groups eventually became part and recognized as part of the racial group of whites, though some do still consider Jewish people as separate an entity, but it's more considered a religious entity as opposed to a racial or ethnic entity. You can consider Irish Americans or Italian Americans as their own ethnic entity, and some do. However, they still generally racially fall under the category of white. All right. Where are we? Indigenous persons. So let's catch up a little. So structural violence is when government policies and practices inflicted specific institutional harm to one minority group or another based on positionality. So for Indigenous persons in this country, there was a massive amount of structural violence. In 1830s, we talked about this a little already, but we had the Indian removal policies that removed they were moved to undesirable places. Essentially, they were moved to places that were much harder to produce agriculture or had particularly hostile climates. In 1851, the Indian Appropriations Act, where essentially they started reservations. The U.S. started reservations in 1870s through the 1920s. 2/3 of indigenous lands were stolen, and individuals were moved from those lands and taken, if they survived the journey, taken to the reservations. In 1871, Indian Appropriations Act said that there were no more treaties that they would make with indigenous populations, and that essentially it was our way or the highway. It was really our way or death is kind of the way the U.S. government ended up taking that. In 1887, you had the Dawes Act, which essentially mandated assimilation for indigenous persons, and they created schools where and this was done in connection to Christian churches where indigenous kids were stolen from their families and taken to a particular type of schooling. And in these schools, they were not allowed to practice their language. They were not allowed to practice any of their any kind of cultural distinction. They were not allowed to dress the way they would have in their culture. They were mandated to wear religious school uniforms, practice Christian religion, practice English language, and taught a specific kind of literacy that did not leave them in capacity to do much with their education, but left them with very little of their indigenous culture. And in 1934, there was the Indian Reorganization Act, which mostly allowed tribal self-government. However, the US government steps in whenever it wants and changes the rules. So there's that. That's a nice way of putting it. All right. So let's get to the 15th Amendment and Jim Crow. All right. Again, we're going to do a little bit of a timeline, and then we'll get into some things a little more specifically. In 1851, we had the Indian Appropriation Act, which created those reservations. Again, in 1865 to 1875 was considered the Reconstruction era, or the post-Civil War area, where they were trying to grow unity and even had many Black men in public offices. And as that power was starting to get shifted, there was very much some really awesome legislation that happened, but also some pushback to that legislation. And we're going to talk about that as we move forward. In 1866, the Civil Rights Act, where there was equal protections under the law, but it was only for specific protections. In 1868, the 14th Amendment, where citizenship was for all those born in the U.S. And the 15th Amendment followed soon after, where it gave all men, key here, men, the right to vote. Women did not get the right. Well, white women did not get the right to vote until the 1920s. And then Black individuals did not get the right to vote again until the Civil Rights Movement. So we'll get back into that. In 1870 through 1920s, the allotment and assimilation period, where again, 2/3 of any indigenous persons were killed, and then the rest were relocated. In 1871, you had the we already talked about this. In 1877, President Hayes officially pulls federal troops from the South. This triggers state-sponsored violence and discrimination of Black persons. So essentially what happened was, in the same way that you had, say, like Roe v. Wade just got overturned, and so you had a bunch of trigger laws that went into effect the second that that was federally overturned. Essentially, the federal troops were there to ensure that Black persons were not discriminated against, and that they were freed, and that they had, to an extent, some resources and were not having violence done to them. And so in pulling that from the South, what you got was a bunch of really discriminatory laws and a bunch of really bad social interactions that caused a lot of violence and harm to Black persons. The KKK took root in the South and again wreaked havoc and violence in its path. In 1877 through the 1930s, assimilation schools were part of the Indigenous children's lives. And again, this is kind of a recap of some of the last stuff, but I wanted to make sure everything was in there. And then in 1884 through the 1900s, lynchings of mostly Black persons, but also included Jewish persons, Italians, Mexicans, and Indigenous persons. And this is when a lot more unrest started to really happen again. I say that like there wasn't unrest the whole time, but there was a social dynamic shift where when people were in office and things were getting some traction, there was issues happening where once those traction for these positive changes were happening, there was violence and negative that would happen on the back end of that. In 1896 through 1954, you had Jim Crow laws. And essentially those were laws that kept people of color from marrying white people, living in primarily white neighborhoods or neighborhoods that were claimed by white people, riding in the same streetcars, riding in specific parts of any kind of public transit, attending the same social events or events that were in public spaces, and or enrolling in the same schools. In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson upheld the fact that these separations were legal and just. and said that essentially you could be separate but equal. This, however, is not really possible, because when you are keeping one group of people from an allotment of resources, they cannot inherently be equal unless those resources are also given, and that was not the case here. In 1917, again, we barred most Asiatic immigration. In 1930 through 1935, we had this mass deportation of Mexicans, and we're going to get into that in an upcoming slide, but that ends up starting a lot of the ideologies and understandings that we have currently of immigration when it comes to our southern border and its harms and the violence and that is done to anyone from South America, Mexico, or even Americans that have any kind of ancestral roots in those places. 1934 was the Indian Reorganization Act that essentially ended the Dawes Act. It was incredibly harmful. There's still not a lot of good happening there, but it did give them a little bit more freedom with their communal spaces. In 1942 to 1946, there was the internment of Japanese Americans. Again, we'll get into that a little bit more here in a minute. 1946, you have the Mendez versus Westminster case. In 1932 through 1972, you have the Tuskegee. I know, I've said it a million times right, and of course, anyway, doesn't matter. Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, which again has its own slide, so we'll get into that in just a second. And then in 1954, you had the Brown versus education decision, which essentially overruled Plessy versus Ferguson and said that you can't have separate educational spaces and them be inherently, it is inherently unequal to make these separated spaces. And then in 1955, you have the murder of Emmett Till, which sparked another round of where are we in this nation and what are we doing? It was one of the catalysts for the civil rights movement, which we'll get into some more here in just a minute. All right, we're making progress. So before we get into the rest of this, let's start with some terms from chapter 3. If I can scroll down here and get to the right one. And I do this, and I put a lot of words on this one, and I know that that's a lot, but I wanted you to have a place where you could go back and find these definitions fairly easily. So I would recommend going ahead and printing off this page if you can, or at least copying down these definitions, because these are words that are going to come up over and over and over again as we work through this course. Structural violence is really when any kind of government or political entity is making policies or putting into practice things that will inflict specific institutional harm on Indigenous persons or Black persons or any other persons of color. And essentially that violence usually comes down to a lack of resources, a lack of options, a lack of opportunities, and or outright a lack of protection from harm at an institutional level, or the intent to harm at an institutional level. Hegemonic are really ideologies that become so widely accepted that they become common sense. And that's Patricia Hill Collins' definition, and she is a prominent female sociologist. That definition she has used, this is one of her older definitions of it, but it also, to be more encompassing, it can also be hegemonic if it is something that is widely valued and not just made common sense, but it's something that is incredibly valued, whether it's true or not, and or valued by specific people high on the social hierarchy. So if a specific set of people have deemed it something of value, it can become considered this common sense ideology, but not necessarily be something that is actually common sense. So again, prejudice is this just beliefs that certain people are inherently different and thus carry different social statuses among the social hierarchy. Discrimination is when beliefs turns into actions. So again, the prejudice is the ideology you have The discrimination is the act in which you do based on those prejudice. A racial ideology is a set of principles or ideas that divide people into different racial categories or groups and serve the interest of one group, the dominant group. They're usually created and maintained also by that dominant group. Colorblind racism, which we'll get into a little bit more in another slide, but is the current kind of considered the current racial ideology, and it's where it's not explicitly acknowledged, but individual prejudice, acts of racial discrimination, and structures of inequality work to benefit white people still. And we're going to get into more nuanced ideas of what colorblind racism is, because it's something that are in several of your texts, and so we will talk about that a whole lot more. Stereotyping is a stereotype is a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a type of people or thing. Segregation are laws that ensure that white people had access to the best opportunities, education, housing, and seats on the bus, along with other particular public spaces and things of that nature. And then BLM, or the Black Lives Matter movement, is part of a broad campaign against racial justice, mostly known for its protests following instances of police brutality. And we'll go over more about them in future chapters, as well as the Trayvon Martin murder, the Michael Brown murder, and George Floyd murder. I don't want you to think I'm skimming over that part of the chapter. I'm not, but we are going to go into it a lot more in depth when we get to a future chapter. And I want to be able to give them their space and to be able to give others within that conversation space. All right. Again, that's going to be one of those that you're going to want to know. So just fair warning. We're in the home stretch, I swear. We're almost there. So mass deportation, take one, and we will do this a couple of times in U.S. history. But this is the one we're going to talk about because it's the earliest. In the early 1900s came the start of immigration policy, or discriminatory immigration policy. You had the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. And again, the Asiatic Barred Zone in 1917, which ended illegal Asian labor migration. Owners in agriculture, then again, we talked about this earlier, but needed to turn to another source of laborers. And so they ended up hiring Mexicans. And they ended up actually going to Mexico and recruiting laborers to come up and work on agricultural fields. And during the Great Depression, and this is going to sound a little familiar, right? During the Great Depression, anti-Mexican rhetoric started, and people believed that mass deportation of Mexicans and Mexican Americans would help the economy by giving jobs back. Nothing that we have currently as racial ideologies is something that is new. It always comes from some other point in our history. And I want to make that very clear, because you're going to see a lot of racialized ideologies and stereotyping happening in our media probably in the next couple of years to who knows how many years. And we want to make sure that we're paying attention to how they shape or molded by these other ideologies in our history, but also where they come from, like where they came from, why they exist, what fears they're perpetuating, so that we can like actually head on acknowledge some of those things. And as white Americans, we can remedy the situations that have got us in this position. And as people of color, can have the ability to live in this country without fear of violence or harms. In the 1930s, almost all Mexican and Mexican Americans, including ones that were legal citizens and had been born here, were deported in raids on communities. They did this in public places. They would do this in religious facilities. They would do this in homes. And essentially non-documented Europeans were not deported. So in the same period of time, the entire rhetoric was surrounding, again, these manual laborers, these Mexican and Mexican Americans. And it's interesting because we see a lot of the same rhetoric now, where if they would just go, then Americans could have these jobs and then it would help the economy. In a lot of sense, it's similar in the way that A, some of these people are Americans. B, a lot of these jobs were recruited, a lot of these people were recruited in specifically for these jobs because there were not other people that wanted to fill them. And also, the mass deportation causes a massive amount of fear in a whole bunch of different populations who immigrate into this country due to the fact that there is this overwhelming historical evidence that if there is a population that the US has issue with, they will round you up and kick you out, which goes against the very fabric of this American ideology, which we will get into, pick apart, and shove somewhere else later on in the semester. But yeah, again, you will see a lot of things and a lot of sentiments and ideologies that are still present, and why it's so important to continue to study this. Internment camps in America. So this is a lot of piece of history that, again, doesn't get as much attention, I think, as we should be getting it. We talk a lot about World War II and how we were the superheroes of World War II or whatever in our history classes, and how awful it was that the Holocaust was, and how Jewish people were treated and what have you. But what we don't talk about is the fact that we have had indigenous internment camps at multiple points in our history. We have done a version of this in several points and done much worse to indigenous persons. We have the documentation for these things are far less visible. And we also did a lot of this during relocations. What would you consider the difference being in an internment camp or a reservation? The only difference is that they have the ability to self-regulate to an extent, but that hasn't always been the case, A, and B, that self-regulation is always overrode by the US government. Well, almost always. Unless it comes to, I believe the only time they can trump the US government is in a child welfare situation where it automatically goes to the tribe first, and or when it comes to a murder of an indigenous person. I believe it goes to the judicial system within the reservation first. But I could be wrong on if that's always, because I don't think it's always. I just think it depends on the state. But anyway, so in Japanese, we also did Japanese internment camps. Immigration during the early 1900s led a lot of Japanese individuals into California, mostly for agriculture. Again, they climbed this economic ladder. You're seeing this repeating history, right? And white California farmers did not like this. They were already starting to push for policies to really change this structure and the social dynamics that were happening here. But second generation Japanese immigrants were perceived as this threat to that status quo anyway. And so they were looking for a reason to kind of justify the take them down a peg kind of ideology that these white agricultural California farmers had. And during World War II, pitted the Japanese against the US after Pearl Harbor. And Roosevelt, signed the executive order of 9066, which ordered all Japanese Americans and anyone of Japanese descent to internment camps. When they did this, they lost all their possessions, lost most of their wealth, if not all of it, lost most of their status, most of their generational economic prosperity. Over 60% of the people in these internment camps were US citizens. I'm going to say that again. 60% of the people that we put in these internment camps were US citizens. They were there for generally 2 to 3 years, and the US Supreme Court even ruled in favor of this order, and that that particular ruling still stands. However, despite the fact that US was at war with during World War II and at war with Japan, with Germany, and with Italy at the time, very few Germans and Italians were detained. It was almost all inherently Japanese individuals or people of Japanese descent. And the reason for that came down to the fact that people were already looking for a reason to do this. They were already looking for a reason to change the status quo because someone other than white people were making this economic headway. And that was something that they wanted to make sure didn't continue. All right. Again, we are almost there, y'all. All right. So let's talk about the Tuskegee Experiment. From 1932 to 1972, a grossly inappropriate experiment on syphilis was done on Black men in the South. It started with 400 poor Black men from Alabama, but ended up with a total of 624 participants, which were all Black men. They knew that these men had syphilis, but they did not tell them that they did. They told them that they had something called bad blood, which is kind of a code or a social word for a number of different disorders and a number of different illnesses. They didn't treat the men, but told them that they were being treated and gave them a lot of placebos and or any kind of like aspirin type regimen that really had no impact on the syphilis at all. And they were trying to study the long-term impacts that syphilis had on the body. And so they would examine these men multiple times over the course of this study, but also had rights to the bodies after they died. And people died from a lack of care. They offered them meals and burial service as motivation to be in the study, but didn't necessarily offer treatment or quality of life as part of it. They were justified in saying that they didn't have healthcare anyway, so these people likely wouldn't have sought treatment. However, in 1947, which was only 15 years after that study started, and it was a 40-year-long study, syphilis could be treated by basic penicillin, and none of the men were allowed this option and or were even told about this option. An employee ended up leaking the story to the press so that it would stop, and that's how this kind of came to light. The NAACP ended up getting involved in filing a lawsuit in 1973 because a lot of the wives and children of these men were now infected as well. So it was not only affecting these men, but also their families and the connections that they had to other people. The lawsuit ended up with a $9 million settlement, which was divvied out to the families and either the survivors or the people that survived those survivors. And then medical treatment was given for all those that were still alive at the cost of the research committee, but no formal apology was made from any of the researchers, from the national government, and or from the research institution that did this experiment. This is not the only example of an experiment that was done on people of color. We're going to get into in our next module, I believe. Is it our next module? I think our next module is on health. Nope. I don't know if that's in this class or not. But in the module, when we talk about health and reproduction and things of that nature, we're going to talk about the way in which gynecology amassed a lot of their different techniques. We're going to talk about Henrietta Lacks. We're going to talk about the sterilization of Black women. We're going to talk about the sterilization of Indigenous women. We're going to talk a lot about how the medical industry and also just the healthcare industry overall has had a negative impact and has left a lasting mark on individuals seeking medical care. And so we're going to get into that in a minute. I'm going to stop here because I believe the next one is the civil rights movement, and that's going to take me a second. So I'm going to stop here for now, and then we will get into the civil rights movement and a little bit more, and then we will be done.